The morning air above the Pacific Ocean tasted of salt and aviation fuel. Lieutenant Commander Mitsuo Fuchida stood on the flight deck of the carrier Akagi, watching the pre-dawn darkness give way to grey light on June 4, 1942. 6 months earlier, he had led the first wave of aircraft that struck Pearl Harbor. That morning, the American fleet had burned while Japanese pilots returned to their carriers untouched, triumphant, certain of their supremacy. Now, northwest of Midway Atoll, Fuchida felt something different in his chest, not fear exactly, but a gnawing sense that the Americans were waiting for them with knowledge they shouldn't possess. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto had designed this operation to draw out the remaining American carriers and destroy them in a decisive battle. The plan was elegant in its complexity. A diversionary attack on the Aleutian Islands to pull American forces north, then a massive assault on Midway to force the US Pacific Fleet into a battle they couldn't avoid. The Japanese would bring 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Sōryū, and Hiryū, supported by battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. The Americans, Yamamoto calculated, might have 2 carriers available, perhaps 3 if they rushed repairs on the Yorktown, damaged at the Coral Sea just weeks before. The mathematics seemed simple. 4 Japanese carriers with experienced pilots against 2 or 3 American carriers with pilots still learning their trade. But the gnawing sensation persisted. Japanese naval intelligence had intercepted American radio traffic that seemed unusually active around Midway. Some officers whispered that the Americans knew they were coming. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, commanding the carrier strike force, had expressed concerns during the planning sessions. What if the Americans had set a trap? What if their carriers were already positioned, waiting in ambush rather than scrambling to respond? The Japanese had achieved surprise at Pearl Harbor through meticulous intelligence and radio silence. Now, steaming toward Midway, they operated under the assumption that surprise was still theirs, but the assumption felt increasingly hollow. The reality was more devastating than anyone aboard the Akagi could imagine. American cryptanalysts at Station HYPO in Hawaii, led by Commander Joseph Rochefort, had broken portions of the Japanese naval code designated JN-25. They couldn't read every message, but they could read enough. When Japanese communications referenced target AF for the coming operation, Rochefort devised a brilliant verification test. He had Midway broadcast an unencrypted message reporting freshwater supply problems. Days later, American codebreakers intercepted a Japanese message reporting that AF was short of fresh water. The target was confirmed. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commanding the Pacific Fleet, knew the Japanese were coming to Midway. He knew approximately when they would arrive. And he positioned 3 carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown northeast of Midway to wait in ambush. The Japanese sailed into battle carrying a fundamental misunderstanding of their strategic position. They believed they were the hunters. They were, in fact, the hunted. This misperception would compound every tactical decision made in the hours to come, transforming caution about a potential trap into the very conditions that made catastrophe inevitable. The Japanese carrier force approached Midway before dawn on June 4th. Nagumo faced an immediate dilemma built into Yamamoto's operational plan. His carriers carried 2 types of aircraft loads: bombs for attacking land targets and torpedoes for attacking ships. The plan called for an initial strike against Midway's airfield and defences, then a second wave held in reserve, armed with torpedoes, in case American carriers appeared. At 4:30 in the morning, Nagumo launched 108 aircraft toward Midway: 36 fighters, 36 dive bombers, and 36 torpedo bombers, all carrying bombs for land attack. Aboard the 4 carriers, deck crews prepared the reserve aircraft with torpedoes, waiting for any sign of American ships. The strike on Midway encountered fierce resistance. Marine fighters, though outnumbered and flying inferior aircraft, attacked the Japanese formation. Anti-aircraft fire from the island proved heavier than expected. The Japanese bombers hit hangars, fuel storage, and the airfield, but the strike leader, Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga, radioed back a troubling message at 7 o'clock. There is need for a second attack. Midway's defenses remained operational. Its runways could still launch aircraft. Nagumo faced his first critical decision. The reserve aircraft on his carriers sat armed, with torpedoes for attacking ships. If he ordered a second strike on Midway, those aircraft would need to be rearmed with land bombs. The process would take time. Deck crews would have to bring each aircraft below to the hangar deck, remove the torpedoes, install bombs, then bring the aircraft back up to the flight deck. It was complicated, time-consuming work. But Tomonaga's message was clear. Midway needed another strike. At 7:15, Nagumo made his decision. He ordered the reserve aircraft rearmed for a second attack on Midway. On the hangar decks of all four carriers, crews began the laborious process of switching weapons. Torpedoes were removed and placed often haphazardly in the rush near the hangar walls. Bombs were brought up from the magazines and attached to the aircraft. The hangar decks filled with armed aircraft, fuel lines, and ordnance sitting in temporary storage as crews worked frantically to complete the changeover. 20 minutes later, at 7:28, a float plane from the cruiser Tone radioed a report that would change everything. Sight what appears to be 10 enemy surface ships, bearing 010 degrees, distance 240 miles from Midway. American ships, northeast of the carrier force, exactly where they would be if they had known the Japanese were coming. The trap the Japanese had feared suddenly seemed real, but the report was incomplete. The Tone's pilot hadn't identified what types of ships he saw. Were they carriers, battleships, destroyers? Nagumo ordered the pilot to ascertain ship types, then waited. The minutes stretched. His aircraft were being rearmed with land bombs for Midway. If American carriers were present, he would need those torpedoes back on the aircraft. But he didn't know yet if carriers were actually there. At 8 o'clock, another message from the Tone's float plane. Enemy force, accompanied by what appears to be a carrier. A carrier. The Americans had, at least, one carrier within striking range, positioned northeast of the Japanese force. The trap was sprung, or was it? The Japanese still believed they faced, at most, 2 or 3 American carriers. They had 4. The mathematics still favored Japan. But now, Nagumo's aircraft were in the wrong configuration. Half his strike force had returned from Midway and needed to land. His reserve aircraft were halfway through being rearmed from torpedoes to bombs, and American carrier aircraft might already be in the air, headed toward his fleet. Nagumo made a second fateful decision. He would recover the Midway strike force first, allowing his pilots to land, refuel, and rearm. Then he would launch a full, coordinated strike against the American carrier with properly armed torpedo bombers and fighters for escort. It was the doctrine he had been taught, the doctrine that had served Japan well at Pearl Harbor. Never launch a piecemeal attack. Wait for a full, coordinated strike that could overwhelm the enemy's defenses. It was sound doctrine. It was also, in this precise moment, a death sentence. The American carriers had indeed launched their aircraft. At around 7 o'clock, before the Tone's sighting report even reached Nagumo, the Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown had begun launching every available dive bomber, torpedo bomber, and fighter. The American launch was not coordinated. Different squadrons departed at different times, flying at different altitudes and speeds. It was, by Japanese standards, a haphazard, poorly executed operation, but it meant that American aircraft were already in the air, searching, while the Japanese were still recovering their Midway strike force. Between 8 o'clock and 9:30, the Japanese carriers conducted the most vulnerable operation a carrier can perform, recovering aircraft while simultaneously preparing a strike. The carriers turned into the wind to allow returning aircraft to land. The flight decks filled with planes taxiing forward to make room for the next landing. Below decks, crews rushed to rearm aircraft again. The bombs that had just been loaded for the second Midway strike now needed to come off. The torpedoes needed to go back on. Fuel lines snaked across the hangar decks to top off aircraft tanks. The ships became floating bombs, packed with fuel, armed aircraft, and loose ordnance. The first American attack came from torpedo bombers, 15 Douglas Devastators from the Hornet's Torpedo Squadron 8. They flew in low and slow, without fighter escort. Japanese Zero fighters fell on them like wolves. The Devastators were obsolete, underpowered, and flying a profile that made them easy targets. Japanese pilots shot them down one after another. Of the 15 torpedo bombers, 14 were destroyed. Only one pilot, Ensign George Gay, survived, floating in the water near the Japanese fleet where he would witness what came next. More American torpedo squadrons arrived from the Enterprise, from the Time, Yorktown. The Japanese fighters shot them down with ruthless efficiency. The torpedo attacks achieved almost nothing. No hits were recorded on any Japanese carrier. But they achieved something the American commanders hadn't planned, and the Japanese didn't recognize. They pulled the Japanese combat air patrol down to sea level. Every Zero fighter was focused on the torpedo bombers skimming the waves. The sky above 10,000 feet was empty. At 10:20 in the morning, Lieutenant Commander Clarence Wade McCluskey, leading dive bombers from the Enterprise, spotted a Japanese destroyer trailing the main carrier force. The destroyer was moving at high speed, and McCluskey made a calculated guess. It was rejoining the main fleet. He followed the destroyer's wake northeast. At 10:20, he saw them 4 carriers in a loose formation, their flight decks packed with aircraft being prepared for launch. The Japanese were ready. Almost ready. The recovered Midway strike force had been serviced. The reserve aircraft had been rearmed this time, finally, with torpedoes for ship attack. Fighters, bombers, and torpedo planes sat on the flight decks of all 4 carriers, engines warming, pilots in cockpits, waiting for the order to launch. It would be a devastating strike, more than 100 aircraft hitting the American carriers with torpedoes and bombs, escorted by the most experienced fighter pilots in the world. In perhaps 15 more minutes, the launch would begin. Lieutenant Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, still recovering from an emergency appendectomy performed days before, stood on Akagi's bridge rather than flying with the strike. He watched the organized chaos of final preparations. Deck crews scurried between aircraft. Fuel lines were being disconnected. The air operations officer was coordinating with the other carriers for a simultaneous launch. Everything was coming together. The Americans had sprung their trap early, and now the Japanese would spring, theirs in return. Then someone on the bridge pointed at the sky. McCluskey's dive bombers were already rolling into their attacks. They came from the sun, from 10,000 feet, pushing over into 70-degree dives. The Japanese carriers had no warning. The combat air patrol was still at sea level, recovering from the frantic battle against the torpedo bombers. The carriers' anti-aircraft guns fired, but dive bombers in a 70-degree dive are almost impossible to hit. They come too fast, from too steep an angle, and the gunners have only seconds to track and fire. The first bomb hit Akagi at 10:26. It struck near the midship elevator, penetrated the flight deck, and detonated in the upper hangar. The force of the explosion hurled the elevator platform against the overhead. Worse than the immediate blast was what it ignited. The hangar deck was packed with fueled aircraft, armed with torpedoes, surrounded by fuel lines, and scattered ordnance from the repeated rearming operations. The bomb's detonation triggered a chain reaction. Torpedoes exploded. Aviation fuel ignited. Within seconds, the entire hangar deck was an inferno. A second bomb hit near the port side aft, starting more fires. A third hit near the flight deck and caused additional devastation. In less than 5 minutes, Akagi transformed from a functioning aircraft carrier, preparing to launch a massive strike into a blazing wreck. The fire spread faster than damage control teams could respond. The torpedoes armed on the aircraft continued exploding. The aviation fuel created a heat so intense that the steel deck plates began to glow red. Fuchida watched flames erupt from the elevator shaft. He heard the secondary explosions as torpedoes cooked off in the fire. The same sight was repeated on the Kaga, hit by at least 4 bombs in the same attack. Fires raged from bow to stern. The ship's structure groaned as explosions rippled through the hangar deck. Sōryū, attacked by dive bombers from the Yorktown at almost the same moment, suffered 3 direct hits. The bombs penetrated deep before exploding, ripping open the ship's vitals. Fire consumed the hangar deck within minutes. Like Akagi and Kaga, Sōryū had been caught at the precise moment of maximum vulnerability, fully armed aircraft on deck, and in the hangar, fuel lines connected, ordnance scattered in temporary storage from the repeated rearming orders. The American dive bombers had arrived at 10:20. By 10:25, 3 of Japan's 4 carriers were burning wrecks. The attack had taken 5 minutes. The Japanese strike force, ready to launch over 100 aircraft against the American carriers in 15 more minutes, would never take off. The aircraft burned on the decks where they sat. The pilots, already in their cockpits, had to evacuate as flames engulfed the flight decks. Many didn't make it. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The mathematics of carrier warfare are brutal and simple. Aircraft carriers project power through the aircraft they launch. An undamaged carrier with no aircraft is helpless. A carrier that cannot launch aircraft because its flight deck is on fire, because its aircraft are destroyed, because its fuel and ordnance are cooking off in unstoppable fires, ceases to be a carrier. It becomes nothing more than a burning target. In 5 minutes, the Japanese carrier strike force lost 3/4 of its offensive capability. Hiryū, the 4th carrier, had been sailing separately from the other 3 and escaped the initial American attack. By early afternoon, Hiryū had launched 2 strikes against the Yorktown, hitting the American carrier with bombs and torpedoes. Yorktown would eventually sink, giving technical truth to the video title's claim that the US lost 1 carrier. But the damage to Yorktown required days of effort. She was hit multiple times, took on water, lost power, and was finally finished off by a Japanese submarine on June 7th. Her loss was slow, manageable, fought by damage control crews who kept her afloat for days. The Japanese carriers died fast. The fires aboard Akagi, Kaga, and Sōryū raged out of control. Damage control efforts proved futile. The repeated rearming operations had left ordnance scattered throughout the hangar decks. Every explosion triggered more explosions. The aviation fuel burned with temperatures that steel could not withstand. By afternoon, Admiral Nagumo had transferred his flag from Akagi to a cruiser. The carrier was abandoned, dead in the water, flames consuming her from within. Kaga exploded with massive force at 7:25 that evening as fires reached the main magazines. The ship went down quickly, taking over 800 men with her. Sōryū, her back broken by repeated internal explosions, sank at 7:13. Akagi burned through the night. The next morning, unable to be salvaged and unwilling to let the Americans capture her, Japanese destroyers fired torpedoes into the hull. She sank at 5 o'clock on the morning of June 5th. Hiryū, the last surviving Japanese carrier, was found by American dive bombers in the late afternoon. Hit by multiple bombs, she suffered the same fate as her sister ships: uncontrollable fires, secondary explosions, and ultimately abandonment. She sank at 9 the next morning. In less than 24 hours, Japan lost 4 fleet carriers, 300 aircraft, and over 3,000 men, including many of the most experienced naval aviators in the world. The United States lost 1 carrier, 150 aircraft, and 307 men. The loss of the carriers themselves was catastrophic, but the loss of the air crews was irreplaceable. Japan had entered the war with the most experienced and highly trained naval pilots in the world. Training a carrier pilot required years of intensive work learning to take off from and land on a moving ship, coordinating with other aircraft in complex attack patterns, navigating over featureless ocean, operating aircraft in every weather condition. Japan's pre-war training program produced superb pilots, but it produced them slowly. The men who died at Midway represented years of training, hundreds of hours of flight time, and operational experience that could not be replicated quickly. American pilot training programs, by contrast, were designed for mass production. The United States was already training thousands of pilots using standardized curricula and multiple training facilities. American pilots might not have the individual skill levels of their Japanese counterparts, but America could replace lost pilots in months. Japan could not. After Midway, Japan would increasingly field inexperienced pilots against increasingly skilled American aviators. The gap would only widen as the war continued. The industrial mathematics were equally devastating. The United States had 24 fleet carriers either in service or under construction in June of 1942. American shipyards would build over 100 carriers of all types during the war, fleet carriers, light carriers, and escort carriers rolling out of shipyards at a pace Japan could not match. Japan began the war with 10 carriers and would build only 15 more during the entire conflict. After Midway, Japan never again achieved carrier parity with the United States in the Pacific. The battle's outcome hinged on minutes and decisions made under incomplete information. If Nagumo had launched his reserve strike force immediately upon learning of American carriers, without waiting to recover the Midway strike aircraft, his planes would have been in the air when the American dive bombers arrived. The carriers would have been empty, less vulnerable, and the Japanese strike force might have found and destroyed the American carriers first. If the American torpedo squadrons had not attacked when they did, pulling the Japanese combat air patrol down to sea level, the dive bombers would have faced fighter opposition and likely suffered severe losses before reaching the carriers. The torpedo bomber crews died in droves, but their sacrifice created the opening McCluskey exploited. If the Japanese had completed rearming their aircraft even 10 minutes earlier, the strike would have launched before the dive bombers arrived. If they had begun the launch procedures on time, most aircraft would have been in the air rather than sitting armed and fueled on the flight decks. If the American cryptanalysts had not broken JN-25, Nimitz would not have known where to position his carriers. The Japanese would have achieved some measure of surprise. The battle, if fought at all, would have unfolded differently. The Japanese suspicion of a trap was accurate. The Americans were waiting. The intelligence coup gave the US a decisive advantage. But the suspicion itself contributed to the disaster. Nagumo's caution, his desire to wait for a coordinated strike rather than launch piecemeal attacks, put his carriers in the precise configuration most vulnerable to attack packed with armed, fueled aircraft undergoing final preparations for launch. The title's claim that Japan thought Midway was a trap captures a psychological dimension that shaped tactical decisions throughout the battle. Japanese officers knew something felt wrong. The American radio traffic, the timing of contacts, the presence of carriers northeast of Midway all suggested the Americans had knowledge they shouldn't possess. But the Japanese didn't know how much the Americans knew. They proceeded with the operation, increasingly cautious, adjusting plans in response to unexpected developments, making sound tactical decisions that accumulated into strategic catastrophe. The irony cuts deeper still. The Japanese had planned Midway as a trap for the American carriers. Yamamoto wanted to lure the US Pacific Fleet into a decisive battle where superior Japanese numbers and pilot skill would annihilate American naval power in the Pacific. He got his decisive battle, but the trap functioned in reverse. The Americans, reading Japanese communications, set the ambush. The Japanese, suspicious but not certain of American intentions, sailed into perfect killing range and were caught at the moment of maximum vulnerability. Mitsuo Fuchida survived the battle. Transferred from Akagi before she sank, he spent months in hospitals recovering from his appendectomy and injuries sustained during the evacuation. He would later write extensively about Midway, his accounts providing crucial Japanese perspective on the battle. In his writings, the theme of missed opportunities and compounding errors appears repeatedly. The battle was lost, he believed, not by any single catastrophic failure, but by a series of decisions that individually made sense but collectively created disaster. In the decades after the war, historians would debate the specific timeline of events at Midway, the exact timing of attacks, the sequence of decisions, which bombs hit which ships at precisely which moment, but certain facts remained undisputed. The Japanese arrived believing they held the advantage, operated under the assumption that they controlled the terms of engagement, and were systematically destroyed by an enemy that knew they were coming and was waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The battle marked the end of Japanese offensive operations in the Pacific. After Midway, Japan would fight defensively, attempting to hold the territories conquered in the war's first 6 months, but unable to expand further. The United States, bloodied but victorious, would begin the long island-hopping campaign toward Japan. Every subsequent battle would be fought with the memory of Midway in mind for the Americans, proof that intelligence and timing could overcome numerical disadvantages. For the Japanese, a reminder that the enemy they had underestimated at Pearl Harbor was more dangerous than they had imagined. The 5 minutes from 10:20 to 10:25 on the morning of June 4th, 1942, changed the trajectory of the Pacific War. The Japanese entered that span confident they would soon launch a devastating strike against the American carriers. They emerged with 3/4 of their carrier force destroyed, their most experienced pilots dead or fighting fires, and their strategic position in the Pacific fundamentally altered. The trap they feared had indeed been sprung not through American aggression or Japanese mistake, but through an intelligence breakthrough that allowed the hunted to become the hunter, and through a series of tactical decisions that placed the Japanese carriers in the one configuration where a single attack could destroy them all. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.